George, you got to experience a public discussion of science, faith, and philosophy, and you gave public answers. Now, what do you do in private, in your office, or you're at home? Is there a particular way that you choose to investigate science and religion?
That's interesting. I'll pretend we're in private right now, although 800 people to the contrary.
Right.
So I actually see a lot in common between what we put into and get out of science and religion. And so I approach challenging myself on these topics similarly. So I see they both ask about how the world works, how it came to be, how we can help one another through technology and kind words. And so I try to challenge myself to think about these more deeply by, first off, looking at assumptions that I have made maybe my whole life that might be a little off, might need some adjustment, might be completely off. And that helps. I'm actually kind of paid to think out of the box. And so, to invent new things. And so I try to challenge these assumptions. No matter what field you're in, you've got assumptions. Even pure math, especially pure math, they have a set of axioms. So that's the starting point.
Well, I find in our conversations that you you have an open mind, and you carefully choose your words to exchange with, and you interact with topics that may be unfamiliar for you, and you are gentle as a guide for me in topics that I'm unfamiliar with. So I think that's you've described yourself as an open person. It's a great question that this roundtable raises about human nature. Some people might say, as James said to me, he's doubtful that there's actually a human nature. He says maybe there are more common things known about people in the modern era. When you think of human nature, or what's common to modern people, what does that bring up for you?
Well, I think what's common to modern people is somewhat shared with ancient people as well, which is, if I had to say, if we clearly vary quite a bit. We're very diverse, far beyond what is normally referred to as diversity. There are people like Helen Keller who couldn't see or hear, Stephen Hawking who could only move one muscle in his body, and the list goes on. We're very diverse and nevertheless have a very important role, no matter what. So human nature, I think, includes ability to look into the past, to care deeply about the past, partly because it helps you think deeply about the future. So we think much further in the past and the future than I think any other organism. And so no matter how we change our external appearance or, how we're born, I think there's a tendency to care about each other and to care about what that future might be for all of our descendants.
Has any of your time spent in the lab told you anything new in your perception of human nature?
Perception. Well, I mean, it's certainly, sometimes people say, well, scientists can't really appreciate, a flower, the poetry and the beauty of it. But I would say, I don't think we're disabled in that regard. I think we see all the beauty that anybody else can see, plus we can see the deep additional beauty that comes from knowing about the atoms of the flower and why they make the fragrances and how they interact with the species that pollinate them and the symmetry, what the symmetry, and so forth. I think maybe it's hard to think about all these things at once, but at least we have the opportunity. So what I've learned about human nature is of that same sort. Is we study the brain, and in fact we even build parts of brains and work with human stem cells, adult-derived stem cells
Things
that
area.
can make neurons, and we study both natural and synthetic forms of humanity. So I could go on about this, but it's not fundamentally different from, I think, what I felt when I was in my 20s, say.
Hmm. Do you think that there's more or less of a danger by using more intuition to assume things about human nature, or do we all need to fall back on consensus, and that might be even more dangerous in terms of how we're going to perceive the difficulties that human nature might encounter with our innovations?
Um, I just need a little more clarification. The difficulty that we might find from our innovations.
Yeah, if you are offering genetic engineering of a certain kind, you might be doing so because you have an intuition that it's going to be valuable. Do you feel like that's I think you're going to say it's valuable, but do you see any drawbacks to intuition, or are there drawbacks to waiting for consensus, and then we don't get to experiment in ways that we think we should?
Yeah. Well, I certainly would not discount intuition. I depend on it heavily. I would not rest entirely on it. There's thinking fast and slow, as Kahneman might say, which is all both valuable. I think the problem with waiting for consensus is we almost never have consensus. There's no consensus on whether we should have automobiles or not, for example. A lot of people won't drive them. That kills 1 million people a year. Nevertheless, they're widespread. So it's somewhere in between. I mean, we have to have broad discussions. We have to educate each other and move toward consensus. I think even majority rule can be quite difficult in some cases, where the 51% make the 49% miserable.
Yeah, right.
So I think as long as we're motivated by helping everybody, that's the win-win that we're looking for.
Yeah. Well, I promise in roundtables that I conduct, I want people to be able to speak personally without feeling judged, because I'm not going to be grading them and I'm not going to be telling them they're right or wrong. So my next question gets us personal. About 50% of the people listening to us right now are going to choke on their Grubhub. George, what do you think of who God is, or what God is? What do you think, and what do you wonder about God?
Well, so I know that some of my colleagues, especially science colleagues, are either uncomfortable or frankly antagonistic to the idea of theism, of God. They might prefer humanism, or that's the term they give to make themselves feel good about it. But I think if you refer to something, a being that is all-knowing and all involved in everything, and call that nature, then they find no problem with it. I think sometimes because nature has mysteries that we can't currently or possibly ever understand, and is responsible for everything. But I'm sure that's not satisfying to anybody, that way of looking at it, except maybe me.
Well,
it's almost a case by case thing. They might get particularly upset about highly personalized versions of some person-like being in charge of something. But then they'll go off and they'll anthropomorphize all kinds of things that they study that are definitely not human. It's convenient, if nothing else. It resonates. So.
Well, George, you did a good job of describing general sciences as scientists.
Yeah. You wanted personal. That was my attempt at be personal.
It's hard for an academic, I understand.
Yeah, I feel that there are many things. I believe there's something equivalent to God and nature that we don't understand, and is, in a certain sense, cares about us in the sense that we came out of it, we go into it, we are all part of it, and that I think is the core part of many religions. Many other go beyond that to say we should care about each other, and I think that's a core practical aspect of religion, which I obviously deeply embrace. I think one of the things that I gained a lot when I was very young, going to church, participating in the community, was there really were very few other communities to participate in, and the kids, one of the reasons the parents were so active is they wanted their kids to grow up in good company.
In good company.
Yeah.
Who might annoy you more? People who say they know what God wants you to do in your lab, or the people who say they don't even want you to think about what God thinks about your lab?
Well, I don't find either of them particularly annoying. You know, I think you have to think about what you're going to do a little bit. So I would say it's ill-advised to say not to think about something, no matter what it is. A slightly adjacent question is, you know, some of my colleagues, again, don't like this, and I'm going to turn this back personal in a second. They don't like criticism. They feel that criticism will undermine our ability to get grants, or ability to get our amazing insights, discoveries into the world where it can do good. And to that I say, no, actually, that criticism is our friend. You know, the movies like, you know, Gattaca and Jurassic Park and Frankenstein, these make it so graphic to, let's say, scientists and leaders, that it's unlikely we're going to make those particular mistakes. We'll probably make some other mistake, but we're not going to make the exact mistake that Dr. Frankenstein made, and Gattaca and the geniuses behind Jurassic Park. So I think the critique is good, and the thinking about it is good. So I would lay on the camp of the people that want me to think deeply about what I should and shouldn't do.
Okay, I'm gonna read a little bit more carefully how my next question goes, because it's going to involve non-overlapping magisteria. Okay. Many of our faculty friends will insist, like the late Stephen Jay Gould did, that science and religion are separate, non-overlapping magisteria. Science is here, religion is there, and there is nothing that one can say to the other. What surprises some is what Gould wrote in an essay's conclusion is that he didn't expect those committed to science to refuse interaction with religious ideas. In fact, Gould wrote the complete opposite. And as I turn to my notes, Gould wrote, non-overlapping magisteria permits, indeed enjoins, the prospect of respectful discourse, of constant input from both magisteria toward the common goal of wisdom. If human beings are anything special, we are the creatures that must ponder and talk. And still, in another key passage in his essay, Gould writes, I would declare to him, the Pope, I would declare him out of line for letting the magisterium of religion dictate a conclusion within the magisterium of science. So let's take a case of current interest. How should we decide about pushing the envelope on genetic engineering for the sake of a longer human lifespan? Could there be good non-scientific reasons for why you would or wouldn't? Or could there be good science-based reasons for why or where you would not?
Yeah.
Have you been in conversation yourself with this issue? I guess that's really what I'm getting at.
Well, certainly I think quite a bit about the consequences of the work that we have on reversing aging. Our emphasis is on reversing aging for very practical reasons. It's just hard to get FDA approval for immortality. It's hard to do in a very, very long clinical trial to prove that you've actually achieved it.
Well, you got to start somewhere.
I'm actually semi-serious there.
Okay.
So I don't. So I agree with your quote from that we should talk between these magisteria, but I'm not sure I agree with Gould's previous statement that there are magisteria, that they are that different. I think they have some common goals. So for example, in religion, there are miracles, things that are hard or impossible to explain, and they care deeply about documenting these miracles. It grants sainthood and things like that. Scientists also observe things they can't understand, which are temporarily miracles, but they want to understand them deeply, so they're not caught unawares next time an earthquake occurs or an eclipse or something. And science will reject all sorts of things that later become accepted, just like the Pope that Stephen is apparently referring to might reject something, and indeed some of the findings of Galileo and Darwin were rejected for a while, and then accepted by at least some of the religious leaders, sometimes 900 years later. But 900 years is not that long, really, in the history of intellectual pursuit, where we all care about how things go. Anyway, so back to aging. I think scientists, when people ask me, are you going to reassure? I try not to reassure. I think it's healthy to question every new technology. You should be cautious and worried about every new technology, and everybody should try to think out of the box about what could go wrong. And what could go wrong with aging is, or aging reversal, let's say, is you could have an overpopulation problem. You could have a problem where whoever happened to be the last generation to not die, or the first generation to not die, the oldest generation, would have an unfair share of the wealth and power, and inhibit new ideas. It could be that, when one says it is against nature, I don't quite buy that. We're all part of nature. We're essentially, many religions even feel that it is our obligation to be responsible for our little part of nature. But just the advantage of dealing with aging reversal, though, is that it's part of medicine, is that many of the things we do in medicine are to allow us to live healthier lives. And if you look at the people who live the very longest, the supercentenarians, they tend to die quickly and humanely, at a ripe age of 116, let's say. So if we could extend youth so that they're really, really happy and healthy, I think very few people would want to give it up. So you have to ask, well, what about the population explosion? Well, one thing is we're increasingly, as we go into cities, the people outside the cities move into the cities, they almost immediately reassess their family expectations. Instead of having 8 children, they aim for 1. So 1.2 is the average in cities all over the world. It doesn't matter that much what the culture is. So that 1.2 does not even replace the population. It would cause an implosion. And there are many countries where that is happening, except for immigration. Furthermore, some people feel that if we have enough money left over from curing poverty, or a consequence of curing poverty, we'll have lots of money and time, we should worry about getting hit by an asteroid. This was one of Stephen Hawking's top threats for humans. and the humans are one of the few species that could literally save lots of other species. And so we might need a Noah's Ark that takes us and a bunch of species to other planets and beyond. So that will require a lot of people. And we may be able to bring the price down to the point where it's just as reasonable to have a house, move your family to Mars as to move it to a place in Western Massachusetts. So anyway, that I could go on, but those are some of my thoughts about questioning whether we should or should not alleviate diseases of aging.
I can see you've thought about this in both scientific and non-scientific terminology. So your own action within the area of non-overlapping magisteria is, like Gould suggests it be. You're conversing between the two areas and trying to find a common wisdom. Maybe this next question will sort of sound like we're going to theology and philosophy, but then pulling back from it, which is, does sound knowledge lead to sound behavior, or does sound behavior lead to sound knowledge? That might be how we try to arrive at ethical and moral decisions, which is another part or aspect of the purpose of this roundtable, is to ask how we come to moral and ethical decisions, especially in the areas that you're facing. So one could ask, well, does George need to bone up on all the theology and philosophy he can possibly do because he's already a scientist and then he'll come to the right decision? Or should George simply behave properly? And in our last summer's roundtable, we discussed intellectual humility, and essentially that can be boiled down to being willing to ask and answer good questions and have an open mind. So are you more inclined to say, no, good knowledge leads to good behavior, or that good behavior leads to good knowledge about what to do?
I think I probably lean on the side of knowledge. I mean, it sounds inconvenient for a scientist to take time to study so many things that are off topic. But I've always been very curious about many disciplines. In fact, I specifically picked my job trajectory so that I didn't have to specialize, where I could do something that would be of value, but required more about interconnecting fields of science than ultra specialization. I feel like I don't spend quite enough time at it. But I have. I took a course in comparative religions as early as 10th grade, and my family background was Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic. So I had a lot of exposure, and at first I sort of felt like they were contradicting one another when I would go from my Lutheran catechism to my Catholic. But after you experience enough of them, you realize they have a lot more in common, and in common with science, than they have. There's scientists say that they don't, that religion is all about beliefs. Well, science is just full of beliefs. I mentioned assumptions earlier, but it's also the belief that we're doing the right thing. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't think it was the right thing, but there's no solid evidence that we're doing the right thing. In fact, quite frequently things like, atom bombs and, all kinds of invasive species, and, the list goes on of things, automobiles, things that are at most mixed blessings. The other thing that scientists or atheists will sometimes say is that, or the magisterium advocates will say, that science is about what you can do, not about what you should do. There's no way you can a scientist can assess what you should do. But I think that's oversimplifying, and I will oversimplify in a different axis, which is that it's always should in order to do something. It's not I should do this to please God, or I should do this to be a good person, meaning to help other people. Or I should do this so that the entire species doesn't die off. Or I should do this so that all intelligence in the universe that we know of doesn't die off. Um, and those shoulds are not that far apart from one another,
Mhm.
and they're not. Inevitably, you will find somebody that will question each of those.
Mm.
But to a first approximation, we can kind of reach a general consensus that we probably would not be a good idea to push a button and eliminate all intelligent life. Uh, so, so from that standpoint, I think scientists can assess should and often do.
Well, you yes, and you do. I guess let me ask you this: has there ever been a time in your life where you counted someone as a mentor that helped you to formulate how you go about choosing to be informed and then use that information to make good decisions?
Um, well, constantly. I mean, I have many mentors.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And are you
I thanked 278 people at the beginning of my thesis, um, and it'd probably
yeah.
be a couple thousand by this point. Uh, you know, some of the early ones, I remember I would look forward um, to Sunday. Um, the pastor, Reverend Hollinger, was a family friend. We might have been each other's closest friends. We happened to have a boy and a girl that were the same age, and parents that had similar interests. And but I would have looked forward to it no matter if I didn't even know that family, because his sermons were really the only intellectual thing in my entire life at that point.
Yeah.
Uh, it sounds odd, but you know, there was no science in my school whatsoever. My parents were bright and they were professionals, but you know, they came home and usually when it was time for me to go to bed, and they talked shop maybe a little bit, and then that was it. And so this was somebody who really would, Pastor Hollinger would bring up tough questions, and he wouldn't even back away from answers. You know, he would talk about answers, and he would talk about anecdotes and parables, and it was just fascinating. So that began, you know, a long line of mentors that I don't listen to them blindly.
Sure.
I add them up and come up with my own sum.
That's outstanding. So uh, glad to hear that. And I would say we have known, if we did any reading or if we've gotten to know you a little bit, that you also have a staff ethicist,
Ethicist, Shantine Lunshoff. Yes.
Shantine Lunshoff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about her?
So Shantine has been working with us at least since 2008. She and a law student, Harvard law student, came to us more or less simultaneously at exactly a time of need. We had a big grant that we had been given by the NIH, my first NIH grant. Between 1986 and 2004, I had 0 NIH grants, which is pretty strange for Harvard Medical School.
Okay.
But in 2004, I got a big one, and my first one, and they had in it a component on ethical, legal, social implications, which I had been part of forming the Genome Project, and I was actually pleased that they were setting aside 3% of the budget for exactly that topic. So when I wrote my big grant, I included that. And then I later kind of got the impression that they were supposed to be a separate magisterium, that they were supposed to write their grants, and I was supposed to write my technology grants, and we weren't supposed to mix them together. But nevertheless, they gave us full budget for this grant, and the LC part, the ethical, legal, and social implication part, was a small. It actually was, the idea was a personal genome project where we would deal with the ethics of sharing data back to the person. I felt it was unethical not to share the data back to the person, and allow and enable that person to share it with other people, which I also felt was fairly obvious. And I felt that a lot of the existing protection for human subjects was actually protection for the institutions and the scientists, so that they could have their little silos without having to share. And I wanted to test this. That was the idea of our ELSI component, was to see if people did want their own information, what they would do with it, whether we could safely share it, and so forth. The crisis was they gave us the grant to develop the technology. We exceeded their expectations by about 1,000,000-fold within the first few years, and meaning next generation sequencing.
Mm-hmm.
And but they wouldn't. And the IRB, which is the institutional review board that passes ethics judgment on Harvard, and Harvard Medical School and Dental School, approved our ELSI project, the Personal Genome Project. But the NIH wouldn't let us spend a dime of the money they had approved on that. We could continue to spend it on the technology, and we had these card-carrying legal and ethics scholars on board. And so what they did is we went back and forth between our ethicists and legal scholars and theirs, with developing a white paper, and they never did back down. I mean, we were very friendly about it, and I'm still quite friendly with everybody involved. But can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. But what we did was we published that white paper. So and then we started the project on private money, and it's still running on private money, and we've had a lot of very generous philanthropists supported over the years. But that white paper was published, and Jantine was one of the co-authors on it, and she and I have published, about a dozen, close to 24 papers, mostly together.
So the NIH money ran out for paying for somebody like Jantine, but private donations are supplying her continued occupation with you.
Right. Well, at that time, she was a tenured professor in Europe, in the Netherlands. Yes, and with time, we've had to seek other sources of funding for Jantine. Dan Voorhouse, the law student, of course, went on to become the genetic lawyer, and he did very well for himself. He became so busy we couldn't really take up any of his time.
Well, I know you talked to a lot of people outside of Jantine, but if Jantine is your on-site person, you know that let's say if I was an investigative journalist, I would ask you, well, who pays her salary? Who can fire her?
Yeah.
And other kinds of questions like, does she only have bite, or does she only have bark, or does she also have bite? Can she actually change things in the lab? And if you don't like it, do you have to put up with it, or does she, or how's this go?
Right. Those are good questions. So we've carefully avoided having a chain of command or direct financial influence on her. That's been a conscious decision that we've made, but have sought to help to make sure other people were involved, partly so that she would have additional juicy ethical issues to deal with. So, for example, for a while she was more affiliated with Kevin Elsfeld's lab at MIT than with ours. She's worked with the Wyss Institute, various people in the Wyss Institute, and she has global reach. So quite frankly, she doesn't depend on us. We don't absolutely depend on her. She does have bite,
Mm-hmm.
and I think in a thoughtful but outspoken way that we have to deal with. Now, myself and some of the scientists, not all of them, bring up some of the same issues. Sometimes we beat her to the punch, bringing up an ethical problem simply because we have more advance notice. And of course, all of us, she, Jantine, and I, beat everybody else to the punch because, again, we're developing the technology. We see it in its crude form, its early forms, and therefore we have more time to think about how it could go wrong and then how to get it back on track.
I'm aware, and we're informing the audience if they don't know, but that your wife, Ting, is also a Harvard geneticist with her own lab.
Yes.
And oversees PGED, which is something genomic education.
Personal genetics
personal
education.
Which goes out and informs the public about what's going on in the genetic science world, and tries to assure people that we we meet, we come in peace kind of thing.
Right.
So I imagine that that's a way that you're absorbing a lot of
Yeah.
comments and
Yeah.
valuable information about how the public feels about what you're doing.
Yes, that's definitely true. I'm deeply indebted to PGED, and most of the employees of PGED.org have been from the humanities and social sciences. Um, they certainly know a great deal of science at this point, but they came in from that different angle, and and who they teach has been important to me as well. I've participated in many of their teaching moments, and these include writers of books and screenplays for movies and television, congressional briefings, which are really aimed at the congressional aides, the younger people that work in each of the Senate and Congress offices, because when they go back to their respective districts, they can have conversation. They can bring those conversations back and forth. So that's I think that's a very powerful thing that PGED does. It's not about lobbying. It's simply about communicating. And it's rather than PGED going to each of the hundreds of districts, they simply have one conversation
It serves many
every few
people.
months in DC in the biggest room that Congress has available for us.
Hmm.
It is popular, surprisingly popular.
Well, have you now PGEd provides a big public funnel of information for you to learn about how people are thinking about what you're doing. Have you ever thought of whether or not you need to, in addition to Jean, hire a science-based theist and a science-based, determined atheist? Would you think that you might need to hire a constitutional lawyer? And doggone it, how about hiring a soccer mom? I mean, somebody who just really represents the public to give you input on things on a regular basis as opposed to an interim basis. I mean, people right in your lab
Yeah,
every once in a while getting an eyeball on things and interviewing you.
yeah. Well, that's a good point. So like I said, we didn't hire Jean. So we do have other people like her who are in our sphere,
Mhm.
unlikely people that you might not expect to be in a genetics lab.
Mhm.
For example, we have an artist, Joe Davis, who just got his second big award the other day, international, and and he makes us definitely question things. He's more a conceptual artist than a graphic artist, and he makes us question things about humanity outside, out there, intelligence out there.
Mhm.
Um, and and certainly I do know quite a few soccer dads and moms.
Okay.
I guess I was one for a while.
Hmm.
Now I'm a soccer granddad. Um, but you're right. I mean, we should have more conversations. And it's almost, I must say that among the part of my intellectual ecosystem that worries about these ethical and policy issues, there's almost a mantra refrain that we need to engage all the people in this conversation. And the problem with that is not reluctance on the part of the scientists to engage with diverse voices. It's that most people don't care, or it's hard to get them to care. Let's put it that way. It's hard to get them to spend time on it. And I have to say that if I had a choice between feeding my family and reading what some egghead at Harvard has to say about designer babies, I'm going to feed my family.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and it gets even more extreme the further you get away from the ivory tower and the soccer moms and dads. If you go to really poor neighborhoods, even if you spent a lot of time with them, it's going to look like missionary zeal,
Hmm.
or it could, but it also, at the end of the day, they really feel like it's not relevant. Now I don't know how they feel, But I do know that very few people participate in this conversation, no matter no matter
Yeah.
how many how many newspaper articles, and they might be interested in the movies, and that's and they certainly listen to their congress or communicate with the congressman in both ways. So that's why PGED goes through that, and also PGED puts high school lessons online, so that
That's right. Yeah.
teachers can just pick them up and use them, and I think that's very valuable too. So there are ways to communicate, but it's still only getting a tiny fraction
Okay.
of the world.
Well, in all the give and take that you have had, and I totally appreciate the give and take we were having, has it ever happened that because you have an open mind and you're interested in good questions, did anybody ever change your mind about a direction you were going in when it comes to your field?
Oh, absolutely. Uh, and I actually think my mind gets changed more frequently by outsiders than the insiders. In fact, I would say I myself try to be an outsider, not of my own work, but in general. In other words, I try to add new fields on a regular basis. I mean, for example, engineering. I've never taken a course in engineering or computer science, but nevertheless, I'm in the National Academy of Engineering. Um, Hopefully, deservedly. Uh, I think there's value to being an outsider. You question some of the dogma. I mean, you might be wrong, but at least you do new things. And so to get a specific example of somewhere someone's changed my mind, which was your question, um, when I was just beginning, when we had just introduced this new method for sequencing, which is now 20 million times cheaper than it was, say 6 years earlier. Um, Somebody they started getting applied to all kinds of new things, and one of them was applied to was ancient DNA. And I didn't do this, but nevertheless, a journalist, Nicholas Wade, contacted me and said, "Hey, this group just sequenced 1 million of the 3 billion base pairs, so it's just a little tiny piece of the woolly mammoth."
Mhm.
And he says, "What do you think about this?" And I told him I thought this is great. I'm glad to see that they're putting our method to good use. And he said he didn't seem satisfied. I mean, I thought that was a good enough story. Not
Yeah.
not what I said, but what the other scientists had done. And he didn't think that was a good enough story. He said, "Well, what if you wanted to test this genome? You don't want to just look at it. You want to make it. Could you make it?" And I started thinking about it, and I gave him the best answer I could give on the spot. And then I went and thought about it some more after his article came out in the New York Times, and and I thought maybe you could do it. And so I started thinking about how we would do it. And then I started to accumulate, and then I started getting feedback from people that would tell me why you might do it, or why you might not do it, or why you might not want to do it a particular way. So, for example, people said it'll be lonely, it'll be in a zoo, and I said, well, maybe there should be a lot of them. Maybe they shouldn't be in a zoo. You will interfere with the reproduction of the females of this. It's an endangered species. I actually was ignorant enough. I didn't know it was an endangered species when I started getting infatuated with this idea. And so I started thinking about alternative ways so we would not interfere with the normal reproduction of the, say, 20,000 some female elephants, the Asian elephants of reproductive age, and so forth. And the list just went on and on of things that were pretty obviously useful to me as a scientist, and also helped me do things that were, I think, more humane.
Hmm. Cool. Okay. If anybody's listening, they ought to pick up Regenesis by George Church, and you'll get a lot of these good stories of how you take care of projects like this. We're getting to the end here. I'm going to bring up something that I looked up. You may recall that there is you said a third magisteria could be Gentine, but a fourth magisteria in the U.S. House and Senate. 13 representatives are physicians, and only one has a PhD in animal science. This means that only 14 out of 535 of our professional legislators have biochemistry training. Is that a magisteria?
Biology or chemistry.
Yeah, biology or chemistry, right?
Right.
Is that a magisteria that we can trust to define and act on what it means to be human? And if government is of the people, by the people, and for the people, what could possibly go wrong, right?
Yeah, well, so it's a representative government, first of all, and if they represented scientists better in the Congress, that means they represented non-scientists worse in their district. And the fact is, in any given district, even Norfolk and Suffolk County of Massachusetts, I don't think the scientists outnumber the rest of them. And so to represent their districts, they tend to be non-scientists. Now that said, there are countries, for example, China, where a huge fraction, I've heard very high numbers of, more than 50% of the politicians are trained in either science or engineering. And they typically don't do it because they failed at science and engineering and went into politics. It's because they succeeded at politics and they decided they needed to go back to school to be able to become technocrats. And it shows sometimes. Sometimes they overstep, but sometimes, for example, with COVID-19, they had 400 times fewer deaths per capita than in the United States. And it wasn't because they they had an early heads up, probably. They actually were exposed to it much sooner than we were, a couple of months maybe. So anyway, and there are many other examples where they have been able to make swift and decisive technology decisions. And so back to the United States and whether I feel that we should have more scientists in office. I think they have congressional aides, and they depend on them, and that they can have as many as they can afford, basically, and that's why we teach to the congressional aides. When I met a young senator a long time ago named Barack Obama, I met his two key aides, and one was a physician, and one of them was a physician scientist, and the other one was a biologist. And I thought, okay, at least that district, that part of the world is going to be have some input. But Barack himself was not a card-carrying scientist. He didn't need to be.
You didn't need to be. You had staff for that.
Yeah. But it would be nice. I certainly have encouraged many of my younger colleagues who want to go into politics. I've encouraged them to give it a try.
Well, as a last question, I realize you can't please everybody, and you can't educate everybody. They might resist education. But between the choice in my own world, I guess between the choice of waiting for someone to make decisions for me, or to take the lead and just do what I think needs to be done, I tend to do what I think needs to be done. But I am listening to what other people say. I feel like you've demonstrated a listening ear about where you're going. But are there any thoughts that you have about how you're going to be listened to as a scientist, but then you're going to also people are going to be listening to you as a theologian and as a philosopher and as a humanist and all the other kind of social science descriptions we can use to describe you? What do you want to be remembered for as you go forward as a leader, in terms of you, George Church, the person, and George Church, the scientist, and George Church, the theologian philosopher?
Well, I'm not sure I'm ever going to qualify in any of those categories. I'd probably be the dilettante at best. But yeah, maybe I would like to be remembered for integrating ideas from all over the place, thinking out of the box in hopefully positive ways, and communicating. My father actually was elected into the Water Ski Hall of Fame. So he was an athlete, sort of, but he wasn't that athletic actually. What he did, he won a few championships, but the reason he was in the Hall of Fame was because he would stand in front of the cameras and talk. He was the first ABC color commentator in any sport, and he communicated a lot. Now, I didn't grow up with him, so and I don't, and I don't believe that kind of thing is easily inherited. But I admired that aspect of him. I think we do need to communicate. In terms of decision making, somebody has to make decisions. I question both the giant committees that have a lot of bureaucratic viscosity and drag. I also question the lone wolf who just goes off and bites a sheep. So I think we need a mixture, and certainly I'm not afraid to develop a new technology. But before it goes out into the public, there should be a lot of discussion. And inevitably, we all vote. We not only vote in the voting booth, but also with our wallets and with our feet, and in terms of things we actually want. We might say one thing when we vote and another thing when we buy.